some water. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Can I have the PowerPoint on? Okay, thank you. Dear colleagues, about 10 years ago, I was working on a research about the history of Belgian childcare, and I explored the concept of dominant discourse. I must now humbly admit that at that time I had a rather shallow view of that concept, as if it was something that came upon us, something that forced us to think in certain ways, but that's not what it is, because that would be a blunt underestimation of each of every one of you and of myself. Indeed, look at yourself. Look at us here. We are the early childhood community. It is us who have the power of choosing what discourse we prefer, what we wish to be dominant, what kind of truth we wish to construct. And that, dear colleagues, will be the main message of my keynote presentation today. I strongly believe that that is a very timely matter, and let me briefly explain to you why I think so. The early childhood community and the research has greatly profited from critical post-foundational thinking, especially since the beginning of this century. Leading thinkers such as Peter Moss and Gudila Dahlberg, critical writers including Gail Canella, Erika Berman and many others, third-wave feminists with great minds such as Rosie Braidotti and Judith Butler, they all have showed us that, and I quote, "Truth is not something that is absolute and immutable, out there, awaiting discovery by an impartial scientist, but that truth is," and I quote again, "the contingent product of particular situated ways of comprehending the world." While the foundationalists or the positivists seek certainty, control, objectivity, in contrast, the post-foundationalists have welcomed complexity, uncertainty, and unpredictability. But the question now, today, is what does this mean for us today? Because today we live in a period where a businessman wins the presidential elections in the United States, despite numerous declarations in mass media that were proven to be untrue. Today, we live in a period where a candidate for the French presidential elections was confronted by a journalist with facts contradicting her statements, and she replied, "Well, that means, dear madam, that the figures are lying." So, what does it mean for us, for the early childhood community? Has postmodernism gone too far in criticizing the scientific quest for truth? When we celebrate everyone's own subjective vision of the world without hierarchy between lay and expert knowledge, does that not contribute to this era of fake news, post-truth, and populism? Has post-foundationalism, and in its extreme post-colonialism, post-feminism, post-humanism, etc., has this paved the way for that post-truth era? Has the end of the great ideologies, or the end of history for that matter, paved the way for an early childhood community without any ideology? And that, dear colleagues, is what I want to talk about. And the answer to that question is resumed in the title that I chose for my presentation, and that was inspired by Paulo Freire. Facts matter, and so do opinions. And I am extremely grateful to the organizing committee in general and to Lucia Balduzzi and Ariana Lazzari in particular to have invited me here and to have given me the great opportunity to share some of these thoughts with you in this beautiful city. There is some historical continuity in how the educational sciences have gone about measurements in constructing what is considered as valid knowledge about children, in how subjectivity and objectivity have been managed, in how the relational, the humane, the social, and indeed the ideological dimensions have been pushed aside by the calculative, the computed, and the technological. I will briefly give two historical examples and then pass on to two present-day examples. My first example draws upon previous work of colleagues Bruno van Opbergen and Sabine van Houten, who is present here. And it is about the colonies for sick children at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It was the period of the Industrial Revolution and great poverty among the labor class who lived in extremely harsh conditions. It was also the period of the liberal welfare state, or maybe I should say of no welfare state at all, because all poor people could expect was some form of charity rather than any rights. It was when leading bourgeois people organized vacation colonies at the Belgian coast for sick children of the labor class. One of the major problems the directors of these vacation colonies faced, according to their writings, was how to select the beneficiaries of the colonies. Indeed, only children were allowed who were ill, yet whose illness would profit from their stay at the seaside. That means that they needed to be sick seriously enough, but not incurable. The physicians who supervised the selections continuously complained about the subjectivity of the nurses who performed the selection. They accused these nurses of being too subjective, of being too compassionate with mothers who pretended that their child was sick in order to let him profit from their stay at the seaside. And their answers to this concern consisted of ever-increasing measurements and new and more detailed classifications of illnesses in order to have a more objective selection of which children could profit most from the vacation. And today, we would label that as a scientific quest for calculating which children would yield the most return on investment. The international conferences of these physicians were endlessly discussing the different classifications. My second historical example draws on the work of Sigrid Bosteels and is about neonatal and infant hearing tests. Hearing tests were among the first mass testing of children, of very young children, besides the APGAR test. In the late 1970s, this was done through the Ewing test. The baby sat on his mother's lap. Visual materials were presented in front of the baby, like colored blocks, and at the same time, quiet sounds were produced behind the back by a preventive health nurse, like a soft noise from a rattle, rubbing a spoon over a cup. And in the meanwhile, the nurse noted the baby's reactions. Much dissatisfaction remained over the alleged subjectivity of the test, and the nurses were repeatedly accused of falsifying the test. And I quote from a governmental document saying that the preventive health nurse is inclined, in order to reassure herself and the mother, to alter the procedure, for instance, by coming too close to the ears of the baby. In the late 1990s, the Ewing test was replaced by the ALGO test, an automated auditory brainstem response audiometry. That means that electrodes are put on the head of the baby can be asleep during the test, signals are sent to the brain of the baby, and the machine registers the feedback, and the machine gives a clear and prompt opinion to the parent. Pass for normal hearing, refer when there is a possibility of defective hearing. Belgium was among the first countries to have all neonatals screened with the ALGO test. It was considered a wonder of technique and a significant example of how eventually technology would save the world one child at a time. And the text on the introductions repeatedly used the vocabulary of evidence-based, measurable, objective, high-tech, and most of all, standardized. And what was especially acclaimed was that the human factor was excluded from the decision-making, and that the exclusion of the human factor made decisions more trustworthy and more true. But let us now turn to the present times. A salient present-day example of measurements of children is the recently launched project of the OECD called Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study, shortly EELS. I draw upon work of Peter Moss, Matthias Urban, and many others on this example. EELS is sometimes referred to as the baby PISA, and that is exactly what it is. Its ambition is to measure the skills and competences of 5-year-olds in 4 domains of development in all OECD countries, just as PISA does for 15-year-olds. And that in order to, and I quote, help countries improve the performance of their systems to provide better outcomes for citizens and better value for money. In time, OECD claims the information can also provide information on the trajectory between early learning outcomes and those at age 15 as measured by PISA. And in that way, countries can have an earlier and a more specific indication of how to lift the skills and other capabilities of its young people, unquote. It is indeed a quite salient example of what is going on today in early childhood education. And in this difficult and tense relation between facts and opinions, between measurements and ideologies. What needs to be questioned, dear colleagues, is many things. Most important is the complete lack of dialogue with the early childhood community. What the OECD defines as what needs to be measured, nor any other aspect of this consequentially project, has ever been discussed with the early childhood community in any of the OECD countries. The danger is indeed that the very meaning of early childhood education, and thus also the daily practice, is decided without discussion with the stakeholders. And another danger is that the objectives that do not fall under these developmental outcomes would be ignored. Let me just give a few examples of what is ignored. How early childhood education goes about cultural and socio-economic diversities. How multilingualism is treated. How solidarity is fostered. How cultural production is conceived of. How social inclusion in local communities is thought of. How early childhood education relates to ecological concerns. These are all quite important, value-laden aspects of early childhood education that remain out of sight. Despite their prominent place in some curricula, including the renewed Te Whāriki in New Zealand, despite the prominent place that the value of democracy has in the Swedish curriculum, despite the room for social support and social cohesion in the recent Flemish curriculum, despite all these value-laden cultural diversities worldwide, the ILS program reduces the act of education to a technical procedure, the application of some general and universal rules, and in doing so, it reduces the pedagogue, him or herself, to a technical professional. Yet, care nor education are just a technical matter. I will come back to that. But let's first take a look at another dominant way of measuring children and of producing truth. Together with Jan de Vos, a philosopher, and Wim Fias, a neuroscientist from Ghent University, with Lieselot Olsen from Stockholm, with Helen Penn-Sue-White and Dave Wastel from England, we compiled a book on the use, or better, the abuse of neuroscience in early childhood education as a new form of truth-making. And I will share some of the thoughts of this book with you now. It seems indeed that we can hardly open a folder or a book on the meaning of early childhood education today without references to brains, synaptogenesis, toxic stress, return on investment, and the like. I think you're all familiar with the political use or the political abuse of neuroscience in early childhood education. An eminent example is, of course, the famous report by Labour politician Graham Allen, of which you see the cover here. It bears this infamous picture that since has been used in so many policy documents in so many countries. Can a more potent image be imagined than the shrunken brain? How could the state not act to prevent such an atrocity? That are the rhetoric questions that Sue White asks about this picture. The figure comes from an article of Bruce Perry, published in 2002, where he reported about the consequences of severe global neglect. Perry used head size as a measure for brain development, but gave no case history for the child depicted, and so we do not know anything about the congenital history of this child. But more important than the abuse of the image is how the neurosciences fit in a political development of the welfare state. The meaning of early childhood education is now to, and I quote, reap massive savings. Or to use the word of former Prime Minister Cameron, what matters most to a child's life chances is not the wealth of their upbringing, but the warmth of their parenting. So what's happening here, dear colleagues, is that the neuroscience materializes the importance of the early years, and by materializing it, they make it more real, more true, and that in turn is used to legitimize that the state, as a welfare state, will not intervene in the profound socioeconomic inequalities that are so persistent in our Western democracies, but that the state will intervene in private parenting. And in so doing, the neurodiscourse and return on investment are two sides of the same political coin. Yet, as I said in the beginning of my talk, a dominant discourse is not something that comes upon us from some dark and evil forces. It is something that we, as an early childhood community, co-construct ourselves. It is not a matter of evil politicians on one side and the good and warm civil society on the other. Let us briefly look at some examples. The NGO Eurochild speaks about child-centered investments and argues with the neurosciences, suggesting the existence of critical periods outside of which it can be difficult to catch up. Save the Children speaks about synaptogenesis, critical periods, and top tips for parents on how you can build your child's brain. Both UNICEF and UNESCO repeatedly refer to the neurosciences to argue for investing in early childhood education, and they use the metaphors such as brain architecture, wired, chronic unrelentless stress, etc. Oh, it is understandable that early childhood advocates use the neurodiscourse and the return on investment discourse, as they believe that that will appeal more to politicians than a value-laden story. Yet, dear colleagues, we should all be very aware that every time that we use the economic discourse to advocate for investing in early childhood education, we also reinforce the idea that only the economic argument is a valid argument. The popularity of the neuro vocabulary and its impact on policy is certainly not a coincidence. In 2011, Jack Shomkoff from Harvard University and Susan Bales from the Framework Institute published an article in Child Development, a top academic journal. And the article describes a 7-year project bringing together the Center for the Developing Child in Harvard and the Frameworks Institute, an organization specialized in framing, that is to say, in mass communication, with the aim to, and I quote, translate science into policy. They report how they have tested simplifications of complex scientific findings into metaphors to study the impact of these metaphors on the beliefs of policymakers. And the result is a selection of simplifying metaphors that work best: brain architecture, toxic stress, serve and return, in order to, and I quote again, explain complex scientific concepts to non-scientists. At first sight, dear colleagues, that may seem an innocent attempt to disseminate scientific knowledge and facts, and not as ideologies. However, a closer look at the publications of this center reveal another image, and I quote from one of their most popular publications. The basic principles of neuroscience indicate the need for a far greater sense of urgency regarding the prompt resolution of such decisions as when to remove a child from the home, when and where to place a child in foster care, when to terminate parental rights, and when to move towards a permanent placement. The window of opportunity for remediation in a child's developing brain architecture is time-sensitive and time-limited, unquote. So what now do these 4 cases tell us about the tense relation between facts and opinions? A first note is that alleged facts seem to be more highly valued than opinions. If you want to persuade someone, don't begin your argument with, I strongly believe that, but begin with, research has shown that. The use of technology entails a credibility that a human factor lacks. Professionals in the infant consultation schemes, for instance, noticed that parents were more eagerly following the referral advice when the child was suspected to have a congenital hearing problem, when the machine was used, rather than when it was the nurse who referred them. Equally, the eminent Italian neuroscientist and cognitive psychologist Paolo Legrenzi and Carlo Imiltà report about an interesting experiment conducted at Yale University. Graduate students in psychology were presented with a number of research results, of which half were true and half were imagined, fiction. In some cases, the stories were accompanied by images of fMRI scans, brain images. And in others, they were not. When the brain images were added, these had absolutely nothing to do with the content of the article. However, students tended to significantly more believe that the article was telling the truth when the brain images were added. Another historic continuity that is contingent with this materialization of child development is the image of the child as an economic investment, or what I would call the Heckmanization of early childhood education. I guess you are all familiar with this picture that is often called the Heckman curve. It shows that preschool programs yield the highest return on investment. Compulsory schooling does a little bit less well, and what we are doing here is a sheer waste of money. As some of you may know, the Heckmanization of early childhood education has now reached Reggio Emilia. In a paper co-authored by James Heckman on the outcomes of Reggio approach, it is said that, and I quote, "The Reggio approach has never been formally evaluated." I beg your pardon? Does that mean that there is no life anymore outside the econometric paradigm? The same paper states that, and I quote again, "Together, Chiari and Malaguzzi are credited with inciting a municipal school revolution in Italy by emphasizing learning, democratic participation, and social activism in early childhood education as an alternative to the welfare model and religious programming then offered by the Catholic Church." Remarkably, dear colleague, it is not social activism that was chosen as an outcome to measure. As most of you will have seen in their mailbox in the past months, this very conference has communicated a free conference pack, including some academic articles and one video. The video starts with the rhetoric question, what do we want for our children? What is our goal? And the answer is, our goal is to have productive citizens. So again, dear colleagues, what does it mean to the early childhood research community? What does it mean to each and every one of you that this is framed as the meaning of early childhood education? That children are reduced to their alleged future and that their meaning in that alleged future is economic production. At the very least, it shows that there is no such thing as facts without opinions. The question I would like to raise is, when did it happen that we leave it to economists to tell us what the meaning of early childhood education is? And what does it mean for us, for the early childhood community, if the meaning of early childhood education is not in early childhood education, but beyond? As White and Wastel argue in our book on the abuse of neuroscience, that is outcome theology. We are in a church. As if evidence speaks for itself. Of course, facts matter, but there is always a choice to be made. A choice of which evidence to look for. A choice of whose voice to listen to. A choice of what matters to be researched. What matters to be measured and counted. But even more importantly, it is not so that science should or even could be translated into policy. Because equally important than the question of what is true is the question of what is desirable. Indeed, policy is about what constitutes the good life, about what is desirable. And what is desirable cannot just be derived from what is considered true. Between science and policy lie ethical and moral opinions about social justice, about what is fair, ideas on what constitutes human dignity, and on what is democracy. And obviously, and very luckily, these opinions and the ideas are far from consensual. Citizens may deeply disagree on these questions, and that disagreement is vital as it forms the core of democracy. Liberalism, it seems that the question of what is desirable is beyond discussion. What is desirable is what is profitable. What is desirable is what supports economic growth. What is desirable is believed to be a matter of individual freedom, individual responsibility, in a competitive and meritocratic system where one is believed to earn what one deserves. It is assumed that the market is inherently fair, and that assumption dismisses ethical concerns about inequality and about solidarity. As Helen Penn rightly argues in our book, this notion of human capital has profoundly shifted from the humane human capital of Amartya Sen to the neoliberal concept of human capital, assuming self-conscious, self-supportive individuals who are responsible for their own development and prosperity. And thus, the Neurodiscourse and its human capital twin brother go hand in hand with an image of the child as what it is yet to become, an autonomous, entrepreneurial citizen, anything but dependent on the state. But there is, dear colleagues, always the question of how we view childhood. What our view on children is. In the return on investment logic, children are seen as a cost, be it a profitable one. The view of the child as what she or he has yet to become reduces education to the preparation for later life, and thus reduces the meaning of early childhood education as the preparation for compulsory education, just as it reduces the meaning of compulsory education to participation in the labor market. In such a worldview, there is only limited space for interdependency, for collaboration, for solidarity, for fairness, for democracy, for care. Those concepts that were so dear to generations of pedagogues, including John Dewey, Célestin Freinet, Paulo Freire, Loris Malaguzzi, or Bruno Ciari, that was mentioned by Deputy Mayor Pilati earlier. After all, dear colleagues, we cannot discuss education or pedagogy without discussion on what education is for, and thus without discussing what kind of society we want our children to live in. A salient example is given by my colleague Jan de Vos in this conference. He looked at the pedagogy of Célestin Freinet, one of these historical pedagogues. What was typical of Freinet and of many of his colleagues in past times is that the social and the societal analysis precedes the educational reflection. Freinet analyzed how the educational system privileged those who were already privileged. It was his profound commitment to social justice and his unprecedented belief in the potentialities of each child that drove him to create his school in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, about 500 kilometers from here. And Jan de Vos has interviewed many present-day teachers working in schools who label themselves as Freinet schools. And what is appallingly clear is that so many of them have adopted what they call Freinet methods, yet not very much is left about why Freinet created these methods. Freinet conceived them as a way to valorize the experience of all children, especially of the children of poor farmers in the mountains in the south of France. And most importantly, he used the collaborative work as a means to implement the value of working together, of solidarity and of cooperation. Yet today, one can hear teachers say that they value Freinet for the individual learning experience of children. And as one Freinet teacher once told me, that it is sad that children from migrant families have so little experience to work with. Neoliberal meritocracy, dear colleagues, seems to have favored competition rather than cooperation. It seems to have pushed forward the question of doing things right, yet it has obscured the much more important question of doing the right things. But as the studies of Katrien van Laaren and Brecht Peleman, two other colleagues from Ghent who are present at this conference, as their studies show, even doing things right risks to become out of the question. Belgium, and more especially Flanders, is blessed with whole-day kindergarten for all children from 2.5 years on, free of charge for their parents. Yet, children from migrant parents and children from poor families are more often absent from school, from preschool. And under the influence of the Heckmanization and the return on investment discourse, Flemish policymakers have issued several coercive measures. When children are too often absent from kindergarten, their parents may be denied family allowances and their children may be denied access to primary school. The unique contribution of Katrien to this debate is that she gave a voice to the parents that are accused to make the wrong choices for their child. And that brings an entirely different perspective to the subject. It shows how the early learning discourse has discredited the caring dimension, and how, therefore, the focus on the very importance of the early years as early learning may be quite counterproductive. In addition, Brecht Peleman has conducted very close observations from the perspective of the individual child in his transition to preschool. And it seems that children from middle-class parents who have the dominant language as their home language are offered much more learning experience than their migrant peers. They are more frequently spoken to, they are less often interrupted, and they are better cared for. In short, Katrien and Brecht chose slightly different research questions. And in doing so, they show that early childhood education is not necessarily a simple solution to inequality, or the best equalizer for that matter. It can also be part of the problem of inequality and a dividing and competitive society. So what is then early childhood education for? Maybe, as my compatriots Maschelein and Simons claim, maybe education is about the potential to give everyone, regardless of background or talent, the time and space to leave their known environment, to rise above themselves and to renew the world. Maybe it is less about that individual child, less about interiority and more about the outside, about the world, about shaping the world and about relating to it. Maybe it is less about results. Surely it is less about predefined results or outcomes, and more about imaginary spaces, about untested feasibilities, as Frère names this, to renew society. Then it is more about what Dewey called making the connection between the child and his environment as complete and intelligent as possible. And most importantly, as Dewey also reminds us, what early childhood education is really about cannot be the monopoly of educational scientists, developmental psychologists, or for that matter, economists. It needs to be part of democracy, and that is, as Dewey quotes, the government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Let me therefore conclude with how I began this talk. Facts matter. And it also matters which facts we put to the forefront. The numbers of children living in poverty are on the rise in many countries. In the Flemish region of Belgium, where I happen to live and work, one of the richest areas in the world, an appalling 13% of children are born in poor households, and this number has almost doubled in 1 decade. In Brussels, Europe's capital, their number exceeds 30%. These are also facts and figures, and these facts and these figures matter to all of us. It is remarkable, dear colleagues, that contingent with the rise of inequality and poverty, a dematerialization of poverty seems to occur in policy, and the discourse is spreading that the most salient source of poverty is education, rather than a lack of resources, income inequality, or failures of the welfare state. International organizations now depict early childhood education as the greatest of equalizers. One could say with Frère, and I quote him, that these organizations are closing themselves into circles of certainty from which they cannot escape. They make their own truth, and they suffer an absence of doubt. The dominant discourse entails the risk that early childhood educators are abused to advocate for a political status quo of a meritocratic neoliberal society in which the interest of the child is considered as fundamentally different from the interest of her parents, and in which, consequently, these parents risk to be blamed for their poor social condition. Early childhood education in that vein is then a remedy for the shortcomings of the poor and thus failing family in the combat against child poverty. But, dear colleagues, without an early childhood community that supports this dominant discourse, there is no dominance of the econometric paradigm. And we are the early childhood community, each and every one of us. It is us who decide what the important research questions in early childhood education are. It is our opinions that matter. It is us who decide how to frame our research in public communication. It is us who decide whose voice to listen to. And it is us who decide what image of the child underpins our work. And therefore, dear colleagues, it is us who construct the world we educate children for. And I sincerely thank you and congratulate you for taking up that important challenge.